Hi, I'm Adrian from Redshift, and for a little while we're going to have a look at how to shade and texture a PBR asset in Redshift for Cinema 4D. Now this is our final render, and we're aiming for something like that, but let's have a look at how we achieve this. Actually, the setup is quite simple. We have two assets in the scene, a crate and a Clementine provided by Megascans. It's just a dynamic simulation with some objects being emitted, the Clementines being emitted, and also as rigid body dynamics, we collide and we keep everything into a single crate. That's all there is. And if we start shading this, and let me choose a nicer camera maybe, you will notice that we have also depth of field, and this is enabled in the preferences here in the Redshift render view, and might notice that we have it also in the render settings. If I'd had this set up on per camera basis, then I'll have it for each camera differently, but in this case it says global, so it's set for the scene. I also have a photographic exposure, so this is how it looks without any post effect. It might not be very interesting. That's why we have all these options to actually enrich our image. And you can see here that the photographic exposure brings everything a bit higher to life. And I also set the white point a bit because, well, I can actually fake a bit of GI. So these Clementines between them, they should kind of throw orange shadows if you want, just because the GI goes between them and just bounces around. So what I can do, this is the default, I can actually give it a bit of white balance. And this gives us, well, this environment is warm, this is a cold environment. So I can have full control over this. Of course, I can play with the f-stop, with the aperture, with the film speed, and so on and so on. And this is extremely flexible. Most important, this is in real time. So you can have your image, your render actually not running, so it's stopped, and this is still working. Okay, and when that's done, you can send it to your render farm and you're clear. We can also set up our depth of field extremely easy in Redshift render view. I have here a click to focus, and I just click where I want the camera to be in focus, and then there you go. I can change it wherever I want, and if I click and Alt drag, I can set the circle of confusion size, and you can see here I can get really kind of macro style or more realistic, kind of like this. If you want to deal with materials or object, we have an object selection mode. You click and it selects your object, in this case the Clementine, or it's the actual crate, and you can further manipulate or set up properties. But most important, you can pick up materials. So I can pick up, this is the Clementine shader and this is the crate shader, and I can work with this without having the actual material editor open, material manager open, or even know the material names or how they look like. I'm not a big fan of shader balls. I like my objects as they are, not tiny shader balls. So for this, when I'm gonna set the actual shader for this Clementine, I'm not gonna use any shader balls, and I'm gonna use a bit of a different scene. So let's start with shading of a Clementine. So I'm gonna switch my scene to something called a look dev scene. And in this look dev scene, all that I have, it's a dome light that has a certain HDRI, which is this one here. It can be whatever you want. But most important, I'm gonna use a C4D shader to pipe in a gradient as my back plate. And this will give me a gradient as a background. Well, I have to enable it first. There you go. Okay, and this is flexible because I can edit it. And I can decide which colors go better for my object. But let's start with the shading of a Clementine. So we have here two assets, and I'm gonna start with this one, which is our Clementine. I'm just gonna simply cut it from the scene and paste it in my look dev scene. Okay, so you can see here it has a default shader we don't really care about. I'm gonna create a new shader, so I'm gonna remove this one, create a new material, and assign the material to our Clementine. And I'm not gonna use Redshift RV for this because I don't need all the bells and whistles that we have with post effects and so on and so forth. What I'm gonna do instead, I'm gonna use a little hidden gem called Viewport Ipr, which is here. And this opens a toolbar that I can just dock in my UI. Now, the nice thing about the Viewport Ipr is that it allows you to manipulate your object and your scene while rendering. So what do we have? Well, we have the Redshift materials, and we don't have any textures yet, so let's bring in some textures. I think these are the textures that we're using for the actual orange. So let's wait a bit for Cinema 4D to actually import all of these. We have the following. We have an albedo, which is a diffuse color. We have roughness, we have a normal bump, and a normal map. So both of these are normal maps. We have displacement. We have something called cavity, AO, and albedo. Albedo is just diffuse color without lighting. Okay, and this is how it looks like. Maybe we should choose a different point of view. Maybe a camera move like this gives us a better result. But still, this doesn't kind of look like an orange. So let's fix first the shape. And the shape comes from the displacement texture. Now, displacement can be either a height field or a vector displacement map. In this case, we have a height field, which is just a grayscale image. Now, Cinema 4D shows this as red because this was delivered as an EXR as a single channel. So the data would be the same if you're going RGB, but in this case, it's just R. So for this, we need to actually extract using a vector to scalars. We're going to extract the red channel, and then we're going to use the displacement map. So connect the X to the texture map, this to the material output displacement, and you would expect to have a displacement. Well, no. Yes, the shader has displacement support now, but the object, the mesh, doesn't know about this. So we need to add a Redshift object. And on the Redshift object tag for the geometry, we can enable tessellation, which makes things a bit smoother, but also displacement. And you can see that, well, our object kind of jumped from where it was. Let me show you. Well, you should see a small orange outline. And if I enable displacement, boom, it jumped. Well, this is not something we expected, and this kind of looks like the whole Clementine just got fat. So that's because we have a zero level, which means the amount of luminance in your displacement map where the displacement will be 0. And this is 0.5 for this texture. So we have to go to the Redshift displacement map and set the new range min and max, offset them by 0.5. So this will be minus 0.5 to 0.5, and everything starts to be in place. Okay, so the shape is good, but I don't see actual details. And I can always check this using a wireframe shader. So if I connect this to the surface, I see the amount of tessellation and the actual final triangles or quads. Okay, this doesn't look like much, and that's probably because we don't have enough scale for our displacement. So let's increase this, and this gives us a bit more of a feel of a Clementine. On top of this, you might notice, if I zoom in, that I still have, besides the actual tessellation, which you can see with the wireframe shader, you can see here, looking at the tessellation, you don't get extreme detail. But still, when you're looking at the render, it feels like. And that's because we have an option here called Enable Auto Bump Mapping. What the Auto Bump Mapping does, it takes the really fine detail of your displacement map and turns it into a bump map and applies that on top. So if I disable this, you're gonna see that this is the actual geometry that we're creating, and this gives us a little bit more detail. Now I'm not gonna use this because I was provided with the normal maps. So let's go and use our normal maps. Now, normal maps are not images, they're vectors, and that means they have to be set to gamma 1.0. And I'm gonna get my normal LOD0 connected to our texture input and this to the overall bump input. And I expect to have a nice bump. But it's not, it's ugly, and it's ugly for a simple reason. This is right, it's a vector, but this is not set for a vector, it's set for a high field, which is a grayscale, just a normal luminance map. We need to set this to tangent space normal. And everything falls into place. And you get the detail that you want. On top of that, we received a normal bump texture. If we switch that, we're gonna see that you have tiny detail here. Again, this has to be set to linear because it's a vector. So I'm getting some small detail here and some big detail with the other one. So I like to combine them both, and for this I'm gonna use two bump maps and the bump blender. So we're gonna have the original one as base input and the other one as base input 0, and connect this to our bump input. For the moment you're not gonna see anything because what's happening, it's mixes between these two input, and when the blend weight is 0, it will use the base. So I need to change my blend weight. By the way, if this is too pixelated, you have the undersampling here. I can set it to 0 and it gives you maybe a bit better result. Okay, so now I'm mixing between the small bumps and the big bumps. Well, the thing is, I don't want to mix between them. I want to use both of them. That's why we have the additive mode. So I'm gonna turn on additive mode and dial in the amount of small detail I want on top of this. And I think that's about right. Okay, so this is how we set up so far, but we still have 3 more textures to go. And first, roughness. Now, roughness works in conjunction with the reflection roughness, and that means it will go in your reflection roughness, which is a scalar. So reflection roughness, and this will, maybe it looks too shiny for you, and that will be absolutely correct. And the reason for this is that if you're looking at the reflection, like reflection weight, the roughness, it's a scalar or a float, and that means it's a linear value. So we have to make sure that the input for this, it's linear as well. So the roughness has been set to linear mode, and this looks again right. The next thing I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna switch my BRDF to GGX, and I'm pretty much good to go. We still have 2 more, which are usually optional. When you're receiving PBR assets, they are usually color, roughness, normals, and maybe displacement. But you also have ambient occlusion, which some people might use it as a color tint or cover, overall color, or sometimes as a multiplier for your color texture. In this case, I'm gonna use it as a multiplier for my albedo. And I'm gonna use the cavity, which is actually just giving me very, very small detail. I'm gonna use it as an overall color. So this will go into the overall color. And and this it's our render. Now maybe the overall color it's a bit too much, it has probably too much detail. Let me just reorganize this a bit so it's a bit easier to read for the person who's gonna pick up the scene and work on it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add a ramp, and this ramp will actually act as a remapper. So if we're looking at the original cavity, I can compress the colors a bit and get the details, not everywhere, but just in the tiny grooves and crevices that the Clementine has. So I'm gonna replace this like so. And I think we're pretty much done with it. But the thing is, this is nice, absolutely. But if I have to duplicate this, I'm gonna get the exact same object in the end. It will just be a copy. So this looks, for me, it looks a bit more like an orange than a Clementine, although it's a bit more red than an orange. But I can do something else. I can maybe squash it a bit, and that's because Clementines have pockets of air inside. They're more like an easy pillar, and they squishy, and you can just they're more soft than oranges, which are more rubbery if you want. So for this, I'm gonna use a max on noise. So if I connect this to the output, this is what I'm getting, and I'm gonna use this as a displacement map. So just duplicate the displacement and use this one instead. And here's what I have. Well, probably it's a bit too much. Maybe the size is wrong. I can decide for myself what size I want. Probably something like this, but not that strong. So the displacement scale will be a bit smaller. Something like this. And I want to, oops, like so. I want to actually do exactly the same thing with a blender. Displacement blender, same procedure, base, layer 0 input, and then displacement. And of course, I want to shade my Clementine. And that's the nice thing, guys. I can blend between these two. See, it just changes the shape a bit, but I can also add them. So this will actually combine this with a bit more. And then of course you can dial up and down your texture scale and get different results. And this is like this, you can vary the shape of your object without actually having to pull a single vertex. So this is how you actually shade this Clementine. That's what I did for this scene. Okay, and for this one, I'm using both Clementines and bananas. And the nice thing is that, well, I can pick up my focus from here, from there. I can pick up the materials. If I need to change the colors or change, well, turn bananas into less ripe bananas, I can do that as well. So I can have full control over this. This is very, very fast, and it's really nice to play with. As you can see here in our original scene, we started like this, but what I did render in the final render was this. I had to set up my depth of field here. Probably I need to adjust this a bit, so it's a bit more interesting. And on top of that, I have a bit of bloom. Let's see if this is visible enough. Just a bit to give me just a tiny kick. Kind of like this, just kind of like an atmosphere if you want. And then the photographic exposure just lifts the whole render. And then the white point just gives it an extra bit of warm or cold depending on what I need to have. Well, this is shading of a Clementine. Happy reshifting, guys. Cheers.